Thank you very much for your introduction. As you just heard, I'm a PhD researcher in Florence, and I focus on extension of copyright into the domain of news and information online. And what nowadays I mostly concentrate on is, of course, so-called press publishers' right. When I started my PhD back in 2015, I was actually faced with a very, very difficult question of, Ula, what will you do if this press publishers' right thing goes away in the next couple of months? Because it was still very new, and it's like, will your PhD still be relevant? And I must tell you, it's not a question that you want to be asked at the very, very beginning, because it's quite terrifying. But I got lucky. Press publishers' right is still here. I am not sure whether copyright did, though. So we do discuss press publishers' rights all the time. Nowadays, it's even more controversial than ever. It occupies minds of politicians, lawyers, public as we sit in here, researchers, NGOs, public policy advocates, so on and so forth. And what I would like to talk about today is actually this discussion. So I'm a lawyer, but it's not going to be that much of a legal presentation, I must say. The discussion about when, like some time ago, I started actually to wonder whether when we discuss press publishers' right, do we talk about copyright? To what extent what we are saying about press publishers' right and situation in the publishing industry is related to copyright and the basic concepts of copyright. And here the first step that I took to answer this question is to try to trace the common themes, the narratives that are being used by actors, both proponents and opponents, of the press publishers' right. In this way, I could figure out some values that are being invoked, some keywords. And here, a couple of introductory notes about the discussion and what I mean about the discussion when I talk about the discussion of the press publishers' rights and narratives. As I mentioned before, the discussion occupies a lot of actors, and there are actors that do belong to so-called online news environment. So, of course, we have news organizations, press publishers, news agencies, and they are both traditional, as well as the digital board brands. We also have authors, journalists, we have digital intermediaries, all the Googles, Facebooks, and also small players. We have CMOs, NGOs, so on and so forth. And how do they express their opinions? Of course, the easiest to trace were written statements. And in here we have open letters, position statements, and other forms. The very important and really broad source was actually the public consultation carried by the European Commission back in 2016. It's nearly 4,000 documents, 4,000 replies, with 80% of them coming from the members of the public. And now going to the next question, it's actually when this discussion is happening. As you have heard today from Will, the discussion on copyright in news is nothing new. It has been happening for more than 100 years. But the one that we have now actually is closely related to the term of current European Commission, and we can trace it back to a year 2014, when in the political guidelines, the President Juncker said there will be a modernization of copyright rules during his term. Of course, the main point is the proposal of the Commission from September 2016, when in Article 11, we have the proposal for the press publishers' right, the related right for press publishers. Since then, the proposal has been going through the legislative process, so we have versions of the directive which have been adopted by the Council of the European Union, and recently by the Parliament of the European Union. All of those versions, they have the Article 11, and they have the provision on the press publishers' right. So now, a brief look about the timeline. So our discussion started in 2014, it's ongoing now. And as we can see, what the Commission is doing, what the Council is doing, what the Parliament is doing, all the European Union bodies is very decisive in how our actors react. So those dots basically symbolize the documents that has been issued by different actors. So we can see that if there is a movement from the Commission or from another European Union body, we have the movement between the actors. And the main questions, what do our actors say? How they argue? So this is what I call the narratives, so the basic themes that they argue along. And in here, I figure out, or I identified 8 of those narratives. Those narratives are not separate in a way that usually when we have an actor, he or she argues along more than one narrative. And the basic concepts that they invoke are common to some of the narratives. Because of the time constraints, I will just quickly go through 4 of those narratives, but all the 8 are there. So first narrative is the narrative of better off. And it's an economic-based narrative that basically is built on the premises that the new right will generate the new revenues of publishers. And those revenues, through investments, will be transferred throughout to basically everyone, and especially people who are members of the online news environment. So to sum it up, if publishers are better off, everyone is better off. So that would be perfect. And publishers in here, or the other proponents of the right, usually say that they usually enumerate all the positive effects that it will bring to particular actors. So when they talk about journalists, they say, we'll employ more journalists, we'll pay more to journalists, we will buy more content out of journalists, we'll produce more content. So in the end, also as consumers or intermediaries, we'll be better off because there will be more content available. The opponents, on the other hand, say, yeah, sure, but there is only a limited amount of money that people are willing to pay for the content, and if there is more people entitled to that money, of course, journalists in the end will get less. On top of that, where is the data to actually confirm that new revenues will be changed into the investments? Going to the next narrative, there is a narrative of equality that basically builds on a presumption that press publishers are in a disadvantaged position comparing to another content producers. Why? Because they also put money in, but unlike audio video producers, they are not carrying their own independent right. And here, publishers actually call this a historical mistake. Why? Because in the analog environment, they had exclusive control when it comes to distribution of the content, which, with the development of digital technologies and the massive reproduction and communication, they no longer have. So what they want to do is to fix this historical mistake. On the other hand, what does the opponent say? It's not really fixing a historical mistake, it's actually following a bad example. And here they often refer to music industry. So they say it's like, yeah, music producers, they have their own rights, so in the end, the authors are not particularly getting anything out of that, and their position is very, very weak. Going to the next, the negotiation position narrative. It's actually a very nice narrative which is used equally by both opponents and proponents of the new right, and it relates to a licensing environment that the press publishers are a part of. So our proponents focus on the asymmetrical relationship between publishers and platforms. They say that to counterbalance this market power that all our big platforms of Google's and Facebook's have, they need this right because this is the best solution to actually counterbalance. If they have this right, they can develop the licensing offer. They will be way harder to ignore by those platforms when it comes to licensing. What our opponents of the press publishers' rights say, it's actually the asymmetrical relationship of authors and publishers that we should focus on, because authors, as it stands now, has little or no say when it comes to licensing their right. And in the case that publishers actually have their own independent right, they will call for even more far-fetched transfer of the right, because they would like to omit the potential conflicts in the future between their own rights and the right of authors. So in this way, we'll have some sort of hegemony on the web of the press publishers. And the last thing that I would like to touch upon, the last narrative, is a narrative that actually gained a lot of popularity nowadays. So it's a narrative which is based on the premises that a precondition for functioning of the modern democratic societies is the availability of quality and polarity of the content. And in here, it's press publishers who are actually capable of providing this content. Press publishers basically say in here, and all the proponents of the right, that awarding them new right for press publishers would be an expression of support to what they are doing, how they are defending us in the informational wars, and how they are defending us against misinformation and fake news. And fake news in here has become a really, really hot theme, I must say. What do the opponents say? They say, but copyright is blind, copyright doesn't really care whether you are a quality publisher or you're not a quality publisher, and it's not able to distinguish between different providers of the content. So if we do give right, this right will belong basically to everyone. And a bit of conclusions at the end. So I did identify the narratives which are commonly used by opponents and proponents. However, as you've seen, all my slides were divided in half because we have a very high polarization of the discussion. And even though they do argue along the same lines, it's really, really hard to find a common ground in there. And of course, we have a very close relation between what is happening on the EU institutions and what is happening between the actors. But unfortunately or fortunately, the tone of the discussion from the very beginning has been set by the publishers themselves and the proponents of the new right, though we do have an active discourse between the actors. So if one side of the discussion is making one of the arguments, the others are reacting and are reacting really, really quickly. And as a food for thought at the very, very end, going back to my main question, what are the keywords? What are the basic values that are being invoked in the discussion? So they are the keywords that are being invoked in most of the narrative the most commonly. I leave it up to you to decide how much those words actually have to do with copyright. I will make my own judgment in my PhD, hopefully. And I leave you with that. Thank you very much.